Hey guys, Coach Logan here again, this time with our game of the week from the online tournaments. This game was played between Joshua Kuravilla from PS 77 and Christoffer L from PS 11, two strong up-and-coming players. And let's jump right into it. So Joshua was playing white, and he started with pawn to e4. Christoffer responded pawn to e5, which is a good move. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. So we get the Italian opening. Here, black really has two main moves, either knight to f6, which is my personal choice, or bishop to c3, or sorry, bishop to c5. Which is another very popular move. Oftentimes you'll find these transposed, but there are some differences. One of the differences, which I'm going to talk more about when I come out with this part of my repertoire series against e4, is that if you play knight f6, you're directly attacking the pawn on e4, so white doesn't really have time to play pawn to c3. They'll have to defend this pawn with pawn to d5, or go for the fried liver with knight to g5, which is also an interesting line. If you play bishop c5, you avoid the fried liver. White can't play knight to g5 on pain of just queen takes g5. But here, white can play this other dangerous line with pawn to c3. Now, after knight f6, white's most common move these days is to play pawn to d3 and defend. And oftentimes this transposes with the knight f6 line, where if black played knight f6, pawn to d3, bishop c5, then white would play c3 here, and this is a popular topical line at like the highest levels. But another interesting option when black plays bishop c5, pawn to c3, knight to f6, is to not play d3 here and just go straight for d4, which is what Joshua did. And this is a very aggressive option. You're just, I like it. It's just like very principled chess. You're just fighting for the center very directly and forcefully before black has a time, to be a little bit more consolidated. So black takes the pawn, which makes sense. White does not take back here. I jumped the gun a little bit, but if white were to take back, then this move, bishop to b4 check, is kind of annoying. For instance, there's some lines with knight c3 and knight takes e4, and they get sharp, and they could potentially be dangerous for black if he doesn't know what he's doing, but I think if black is prepared enough, then they should be doing reasonably well. But after e takes d4, Joshua played another very, very interesting move, which is seen a little bit of a revival these days, is this idea of just pawn to e5. Which is a very aggressive idea. You're sort of temporarily giving a pawn on d4 to just really sort of disrupt black's coordination with your pawn on e5. One of my friends, who's a strong player and another coach, he was telling me recently that when you have a pawn on e5, it means you have good attacking chances because they won't have a knight on f6, and the knight on f6 is a good defender. So a lot of times having a pawn on e5 is like a signal that you should be attacking. And here is where I think Christoffer went wrong. He played knight to e4. Pretty much any knight move, I think, here runs into trouble. So for instance, if knight g4, well, then white can just recapture his pawn and say, okay, it's even in material, your pieces are all sort of misplaced over the board. You can throw in this check, but even after just knight c3, white's development makes a lot more sense. I'm not sure what this knight is doing here on g4. It's going to get kicked later with h3. White's just going to castle. This is much better for white. If knight h5, well, then knight to g5 comes, and white is threatening both f7 and this knight on h5. I think it's kind of obvious we don't want to go knight g8, but here white could actually just, he could grab his pawn back on d4 and have a huge advantage, but here he could also just castle, because after d takes c3, then queen d5 is forking f7 and taking the bishop on c5. So only move would be something like queen e7, but now after just simple recapture, white's down one pawn, but his bishop is coming to g5. If black plays either d6 or f6, we get some sort of exchange followed by rook e1. Knight to b5 comes in. It's an overwhelming attack. Okay, so after e5, black here should play, if you play this line as black, I think it's critical to play the move pawn to d5 now. And here, white will save his bishop with bishop to b5, and then black can play knight e4. And I think there's a pretty critical difference in this line and what happened in the game. White can now take this pawn, and then black has a choice between either retreating the bishop to b6 or going bishop b4 check. Both of them are interesting lines. And it's an interesting position with chances for both sides. After d5, white does not really want to take this knight because black can just grab the bishop, and while this pawn looks like it's going on an impressive run, rook g8 will stop it. Material is actually even at the moment, and black has a pretty nice bishop pair, and is probably just going to bring his king-queen side, and I think black's position is actually quite nice in these types of positions. But, okay, so let's look at what happened in the game. So after e5, Christoffer played knight to e4, which seems like a very natural move, but the problem is this knight is just a little bit loose here, right? It really needs this pawn on d5 defending it, and Joshua found the best continuation here, which is to just play bishop d5 and attack this loose knight while also preventing pawn to d5 to defend it. So now it's very difficult to deal with this knight. This knight has nowhere it can go that's backwards. It can't go to d6, f6, can't go to g5 because of our knight and our bishop. He could play a move like f5, but even after just something simple like recapturing, I don't know how black plans to castle in this position. I think that they're just going to have long-term king safety issues with our bishop sitting here and this diagonal opened. So this all looks pretty bad for black. Christoffer found an interesting continuation. He decided that since he already grabbed one pawn and his knight is under attack, he sacrificed the knight for a second pawn, which will drag the king out to f2, and then took a third pawn, this time with check. Please note, white is not in time to block here with bishop e3 because of, well, actually, black can just take this bishop first with check and then play take on b2, and he's going to win some material. So white played here king f1. So there's some debate about where this king should go. I've actually heard that from g3 is an interesting square too, but king f1 is reasonable enough. Black takes a fourth pawn, although this time white recaptures. And so now we get this position where technically it's actually even in material. Black has grabbed 3 pawns for the sacrificed knight. But the big problem is white's lead in development. White has out now these 2 bishops, the knight. This pawn on e5 again is preventing critical defenders from helping the black king. This knight has a very easy kind of path into the game by just something like knight c3 and knight e4. So this attack, so white's development could get really out of hand for black pretty quickly. If white were to just trade off all pieces, then I think black stands to do pretty well in the resulting endgame because of their extra pawns. I mean, a collection of pawns for a piece starts to matter in an endgame when they can just swarm, the 6th, 7th, and 8th ranks. Then it becomes a big problem. But here the problem is that when you have more pieces than your opponent, you have good attacking chances because you can overwhelm their defenses. And that's exactly what happened. So let's see. So black castles. White plays knight c3. Black attacks this pawn with rook to e8. I think this was Chris's last chance to stay in the game with something like pawn to d6 and just try to undermine this pawn on e5 and open up lines for his pieces. Again, if he can get it, if he can start to water down the brunt of this attack, I still like white's extra piece, but it'll at least be a game again. Instead, rook e8. The problem with this move is now knight e4 comes, and it comes with a critical tempo on this bishop on c5, which he retreats to b6, but that tempo gained was pretty important. Now we see knight f to g5, which is threatening to take on f7 with a win of material. So Chris plays rook to f8, but now the other point of playing knight f to g5 was to open up a path for the queen to get in, and we can really see now Joshua's pieces are swarming black's king, kind of like bees or something. There's just so many of them. The bishop, the 2 bishops, the 2 knights, the pawn on e5, and the queen. Really, it makes it like there's 6 attacking pieces here, and that is just very difficult to withstand. Chris tried h6 to get rid of the knight. And Joshua found a sufficient continuation here. He decided that with this large an attacking ratio, he played knight f6 with check, and which is good enough. We'll come back to that. Instead, I think the even quicker win was actually this nice move here. Very nice move. Queen to g6, taking advantage of this pin and just threatening queen into h7 with checkmate. So here, black would have to play... he would have to take on g5, and now knight f6. Once again, just notice all of the pins on black's pawns. The bishop pins the f pawn, the queen pins the g pawn. At this point, black would have to sacrifice his queen, because if king h8, then just queen h7, or queen h7 is checkmate. So he would have to sacrifice his queen, and now after e takes f6, I don't see how black can stop queen takes g7. Plus, he's down, a queen at this point, so it's all over. Instead, Joshua went knight f6 check, which was also quite strong. Black played g takes f6, which should be forced mate in 2, but just to show you, if they play king h8, it's still losing. Knight takes f7 check, forcing rook takes f7, queen takes f7, and this is now threatening stuff, for instance, like knight to e8, and then queen into g8, or queen takes g7. And there's just no good way to deal with these threats. Like if you take this knight, white can just take back with the pawn, and he's threatening queen into g7, and if he moves the queen, then he'll have f7, and there's just no way to deal with these. There's no way to even defend g7, because queen g8 is unavailable, because if queen g8, you just take, and it's checkmate. So after knight f6 check, Christoffer played g takes f6, and here, okay, Joshua found mate in 3. There's actually a mate in 2. Again, if we use the advantage, if we use this pin that we have on this f7 pawn, we have queen to g6 check, and then queen to h7 is checkmate. Joshua played bishop takes f7 check, and then we got king g7. Now queen to g6 is check, and then final move, queen. I think it was queen takes h6 with checkmate. So. Really, really nice game from Joshua. Very strong attacking game. I think that's, chess at its most fun is when you can throw stuff at your opponent's king, and Joshua did a very good job in this game of that. So if I was going back to the kind of critical moment in the opening, especially if you play this line as black, I think your two options here, one, again, you could play knight f6, and now there's no c3. You'll have to be prepared to play against the fried liver, which is a separate issue, if you do play this bishop c5 line, c3, knight f6, and then d4, if takes e5, it's absolutely critical to throw in this intermezzo pawn to d5. White will move his bishop somewhere. Either bishop e2 is a little bit less common. Bishop e5 is most likely. Now knight e4. Now there's no bishop to d5. Your knight is at least secure here, and after takes, you could either go bishop to b6 or bishop to b4 check, and the game continues. But yeah, this is if you play white here, this is nice because pretty much any knight move they make runs into really big trouble. All right, so great job to the players involved, and I will be back with another video shortly.